Hey Optimancers, Chris here. I'm going to be talking about the Armor of Agathys spell in detail in this video. Not just how it works, but how to get the most out of this spell. It's a spell that's pretty good, but it's also a spell with tons of potential if we really dive into how to make the most out of it. So let's start with the basics. So the Armor of Agathys spell actually isn't as readily available as most first level spells are. None of the backgrounds in Ravnica get it, nor Strixhaven. You can't even get it through the Strixhaven Initiate feat, or Fey Touched, or Shadow Touched. You won't find it on any of the optional spell list spells from Tash's Cauldron of Everything. Now I want to interrupt this video for a moment. I had written this video, recorded it, and then I was pinged on my Discord and told that Bilbron Bafflestone had done a deep dive into the Armor of Agathys spell fairly recently. I am recording this on August 9th, and he had posted one on August 3rd, so I decided I better stop and watch that video. And I watched the video, and I noticed that he made a lot of the same points that I'm going to be making in this video, but he also has a different perspective than I do on a lot of things, so I think that it would be worth it for you to watch both videos if you really want to know all the perspectives for the Armor of Agathys spell. So I'm going to link his video down below. And the other thing I wanted to point out is he actually noted something that I had missed, and that is that there are a couple racial ways that you can get the Armor of Agathys spell. The first is you could take the Levistus Tiefling. Now this is technically in a book that is probably now obsolete, and that is Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes had a variant for the Tiefling, and that variant could cast Armor of Agathys, though only at first level and only once per long rest. So it really wasn't a good method to get it. But the other method he mentioned was the Mark of Warding Dwarf, and this is an Eberron campaign setting specific racial option for dwarf, and they would get Armor of Agathys. And this one is more interesting because if you were to take this Mark of Warding Dwarf, Armor of Agathys would be considered part of your class spell list regardless of your class. So later in this video I'll talk about how a Scribe's Wizard can change damage types, but there's no way to get Armor of Agathys as a wizard spell. Well, it turns out that Bilbron came up with a way that I had not realized, and that would be if you took the Mark of Warding Dwarf. But I'm going to be linking his video down below, and Bilbron is a great optimizer and a friend of the channel, so I just wanted to give him a shout out in the video comment section down below. So this means if you want the Armor of Agathys spell, you need to either get it through the Magical Initiate feat, selecting Warlock, and that means you won't be able to use your spell slots to cast it unless you're already a Warlock, in which case you didn't need the feat in the first place. Or you get it through the Warlock spell list through Warlock levels, or the Oath of Conquest Paladin, or finally, the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer can use Clockwork Magic to access the spell. So if you need one more incentive to dip Warlock, there you go. It's a first level spell, 1 action to cast, range itself, 1 hour duration, no concentration. After casting the spell, you get 5 temporary hit points that last the 1 hour duration of the spell, and as long as you have any of those temporary hit points remaining, a creature that hits you with a melee attack takes 5 cold damage. If you cast a spell with a higher level spell slot, both the temporary hit points and cold damage increase by 5 points per slot level. The Armor of Agathys spell is a good spell on its own. You cast it, you get some temporary hit points, and maybe you do a bit of damage. It's just a first level slot, but if we use a higher level slot, the scaling is good. And it's a Warlock spell, and the Warlock spell list at level 1 isn't all that impressive, so why not take this spell? And that's the video, I guess. Oh wait, this is an optimization channel. Maybe I should talk about how to make this pretty good spell and turn it into an amazing spell. Okay, so this is how it normally goes. You cast Armor of Agathys, you get some temporary hit points, then you take some damage and you lose them, and if you're lucky and the damage was caused by a melee attack, then the creature that damaged you takes some damage. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. But Armor of Agathys has some opportunities to be an amazing damage dealing spell. Look at it this way. Let's say we have a higher level wizard and we want to deliver a lot of single target damage. Maybe we have one of the ways to boost Magic Missile, but with Magic Missile we're always worried about a shield spell, because that shuts it down entirely. Maybe Disintegrate. But that has the problem that if the creature makes its saving throw, it takes 0 damage, and legendary resistance is a thing. But you know what? Then there's Finger of Death. This is a 7th level spell, uses your action, you target a creature within 60 feet, and the creature takes 7d8 plus 30 necrotic damage. And even if they save, they still take half damage. So 7d8 plus 30, that's 61.5 average damage. Say 50% chance for the creature to make it save, in which case it's taking 30 points of damage. So on average, about 46 points. Now maybe you have some bonus action damage or summon creatures, so you might do more damage overall on your turn, but the Finger of Death spell alone is dealing about 46 points of damage. Now, let's say we cast Armor of Agathys with a 7th level slot outside of combat. We enter combat, and then let's say we get hit with a melee attack. Well, that creature takes 35 damage, not quite the 46. But let's just hypothetically say that we didn't lose all those temporary hit points after taking that attack, and then we got hit with another melee attack. Well, now we're at 70 damage. That's over 50% higher than a Finger of Death. Plus, we got the temporary hit points. Plus, we didn't lose an action in combat. And we didn't even need to have 7th level spells. We just needed 7th level spell slots. Let's now hypothetically say we still have some of those temporary hit points and we get hit with another melee attack. Well, now that's 105 damage. No saving throw. Remember, with Armor of Agathys, even if you only have one of those temporary hit points left, the melee attacker still takes the full 35 damage if they hit you. But you know what? That's just a hypothetical situation. If you're at 13th level, I wouldn't count on that first hit doing less than 35 damage. And who's to say it's even a melee attack? You get hit with a ranged attack for 35 hit points, and Armor of Agathys delivers 0 damage. You know, it still saved us 35 hit points of actual damage, but that was a 7th level slot. But let's say it is a melee attack, but the creature's immune to cold damage, or even resistant. Well, then again, that damage either is gone or heavily reduced. So, hypothetically, Armor of Agathys can deliver a lot of damage. So when it comes to optimizing Armor of Agathys, it's all about taking those hypotheticals and doing all we can to make them more probable. I can narrow optimizing Armor of Agathys down to 3 main challenges. The first is that the cold damage Armor of Agathys delivers isn't super reliable damage. Now, there aren't a huge number of creatures immune to cold damage. I mean, fewer than half as many as are immune to fire damage. But there are a fair number of creatures that are resistant. The second is that damage from anything except melee attacks will reduce our temporary hit points, but won't deliver any damage. And the third is, if the damage we take is high enough, we could lose Armor of Agathys after the first instance of damage. If that happens, we're at best delivering okay damage. I should finally mention, and this isn't a challenge, it's just a reality we need to accept, is that temporary hit points cannot be replenished. They can only be replaced. So if we replace our temporary hit points from any source, we lose the spell. I guess unless you cast Armor of Agathys again, but you know what? In that case, you're still not replenishing the spell, you're just replacing the spell. So let's talk about these challenges one by one and discuss what we can do to address them. The first is the cold damage type. This isn't necessarily something you need to address at all. Cold is far from the worst damage type. Compared to poison, it's very reliable. But even compared to fire, it's more reliable. Still, we do have some options to improve it yet. You could take the Elemental Adept feat. If we were to select cold damage, then we would at least ignore resistance. An entire feat, though, that is a pretty big cost. When I think of the various builds on this channel, even fitting one more extra feat onto 90% of them would require some major sacrifices. Sacrifices that might even prevent those builds from working. Now, once again, this is an edit from the initial version of this video, because here's where I was going to mention that Order of Scribes can change damage types of spells, but only for wizard spells. And therefore, since you can't get Armor of Agathys as a wizard spell, they would be unable to use this feature. However, as Bilbron Bavelstone mentioned in his video, Mark of Warding Dwarf from the Eberron campaign setting can get the Armor of Agathys spell, and it's treated as a spell from your character's class list. So that would be a way to get it on the wizard spell list for your character. Now, it's only available through Eberron, so if you're not using Eberron content, then that's not going to apply to you. But if you are using Eberron content, then Order of Scribes actually is a possibility here. If you took Mark of Warding Dwarf, then you could use this feature to change the damage type to anything you wanted to, as long as you had that kind of damage on another first level spell. And you can pretty much get any kind of damage you want by selecting the right spells. Then there's Transmuted Spell Metamagic, and that will work. And for 1 sorcery point, you can change the damage type of a cold damage spell to Acid, Fire, Lightning, Poison, or Thunder. From that list, I would say Thunder would be the most reliable option. That would mean you would either want the Metamagic Adept feat, and we already went over this. If I've got an extra feat slot, I might as well grab Elemental Adept. The second is to actually grab at least 3 sorcerer levels to get Transmuted Spell Metamagic. Now this isn't so bad. Warlock and Sorcerer multiclass well, and as I mentioned, the Clockwork Soul Sorcerer can get Armor of Agathys as a Clockwork Magic spell. If we were a Conquest Paladin, again, multiclassing Sorcerer is a pretty strong option already. So yeah, the first challenge, I think our answer is Transmuted Spell. That brings us to our second challenge. Armor of Agathys doesn't require an action in combat on our part. Instead, it requires we get hit with melee attacks. So, how do we encourage our enemies to make melee attacks rather than inflict ranged damage or other damage types? Well, for a lot of enemies, this isn't a problem. The books are filled with creatures that only do melee attacks. But what about creatures that have other options? I think the basics here should be obvious enough. If you're in melee, you're going to face way more melee attacks. Also, there are a number of ways we might encourage those melee attackers to attack us rather than other party members. Though I think that's a topic for an entire video, and not this one. But yeah, our Warlock Eldritch Blasting from 100 feet away is unlikely to take many melee attacks. Our Fighter or Barbarian swinging away in melee is going to take a lot of them. It's really not rocket science. Melee characters get way more out of this spell. And that brings us to our final challenge. How do we keep Armor of Agathys from just dropping after one attack? Well, the most obvious answer is that the higher spell slot level we use to cast a spell, the more temporary hit points it provides. So a second level slot used to cast Armor of Agathys doesn't just deliver twice the damage, it also provides twice the temporary hit points. But that's not enough on its own. As our spell slot progression scales, monster damage is scaling too. So just as a first level character might take 5 hit points damage in a single melee attack, a third level character might take 15. So what else can we do to preserve those temporary hit points while still getting hit? We know we cannot replenish them. Well, there's increasing your armor class, or causing attacks that would otherwise hit to miss. Those don't really work for us though. Armor of Agathys only delivers damage if you're hit. What we want to do is find a way to be hit and still maintain those temporary hit points. So what we want isn't chance to hit reduction, it's damage reduction. Well, that brings us back to feats. The Heavy Armor Master feat reduces any bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage you take from non-magical attacks by 3. So let's say we have a first level Armor of Agathys spell up, and so we have 5 temporary hit points. One melee attack that does 5 damage, the spell is over. But let's say we take that attack and we have the Heavy Armor Master feat. Well, instead of 5 damage, we would take 2 damage, and the spell is still up, and then we get hit again for another 5, again reduced to 2, and it's still up, and then the third hit finally drops the spell. So instead of taking and delivering 5 points of damage, instead we took 6 points of damage over 3 attacks and delivered 15 points of damage. And that sounds amazing. The problem is, of course, that 3 points of damage reduction at level 1 is amazing. Just outstandingly good. 3 points of damage reduction at level 5 is decent, but far less dramatic. 3 points of damage reduction at level 11? We're not talking irrelevant, but we are talking about attacks that deliver way more damage. For example, let's say you get hit by the sword of a storm giant. Well, that's 30 damage on average. We reduce that by 3, and that's a 10% reduction. There's also more creatures at the higher challenge ratings that have their attacks treated as magical, in which case they would ignore your resistance. Still, even that one attack would drop a 5th level Armor of Agathys in one hit, even with Heavy Armor Master. Still, Heavy Armor Master as a feat could be just as effective for damage as Elemental Adept, except as a half feat we also get an ability score increase, and there's the defensive element, so you know what, this is a possibility. What else reduces damage? Well, what about damage resistance? Let's look at that example again. So let's say we have damage resistance. That 30 damage from the Greatsword attack becomes 15, and our temporary hit points from a 5th level Armor of Agathys spell holds, and the Storm Giant has to hit us again to drop it. Now we've reduced 60 hit points of damage to 5 actual hit points of damage by combining Armor of Agathys and resistance, and we've delivered 50 points of damage. Even without transmuted spell metamagic, then the Storm Giant has resistance to cold damage and is still taking 4 times more than what it delivered in actual damage. And it's the one that used up its action. So how do we get resistance to damage? Well, depends on the type of damage, but when we're talking about melee attacks, we should be looking primarily at piercing, slashing, or crushing. So a Barbarian's Rage, potentially a Fiend Warlock's Fiendish Resilience, or a Genie Dao Patron's Crushing Resistance. Perhaps a Stone Skin spell, or Shatter Kai for that one round after using Blessing of the Raven Queen. How about the Blade Ward cantrip? There's a number of ways, though Barbarian Rage is probably the easiest and most comprehensive. But we don't want to stop just there. There's got to be other ways to reduce the damage taken from a melee attack. Well, if you're a 5th level rogue and you have your reaction available, then Uncanny Dodge halves the damage of the attack, but it is not resistance. Resistance doesn't stack with itself, but there is no reason you can't have the damage of an attack twice. So if we had resistance and Uncanny Dodge, that 30 damage becomes 15 after resistance, and then just 7 after Uncanny Dodge. Now that Storm Giant isn't going to drop the Armor of Agathys at all with its 2 attacks. Another way we could reduce the damage is the School of Abjuration Wizard. Arcane Ward provides a magical barrier that eats up to twice your wizard level plus your intelligence modifier. If you're hit with an attack, then this ward takes the damage before they hit your temporary hit points. Keep in mind though, your resistance will not apply to that damage. So let's say you had a character with 2 levels of Abjure Wizard and a 16 intelligence. That would give you a 7-point ward. So if that Storm Giant hit you for 30 damage, you would reduce the damage to 23, and then you would apply any resistance you had, which would reduce it to 11. So what else can we do to reduce damage? Well, we go back to Clockwork Soul Sorcerers. Yeah, they're coming up a lot. Bastion of Law allows you to create a ward using your sorcery points. You expend up to 5 sorcery points, and when you take damage, you expend up to all 5, and roll that many d8s, reducing the damage by the total you roll. So let's say that Storm Giant hits us with the 30 damage attack. We spend 2 points from our Bastion of Law, that would reduce it to 21 on average. Then if we have resistance, that would reduce it to 10. If we did that twice, the Storm Giant takes 2 instances of damage, and our Armor of Agathys is still hanging on with 5 temporary hit points. What else could we do? Well, there's some other reaction options that could reduce the damage we take. Of course, keep in mind you only get 1 reaction, and we've already looked at Uncanny Dodge, which is probably the most effective in my opinion. But in addition, a Battlemaster fighter has the parry maneuver that can use your reaction to reduce the damage taken by the roll of the superiority die plus your dexterity modifier. The Psi Warrior can use their reaction to reduce the damage taken by the result of the psionic die plus their intelligence modifier. The Goliath can use their reaction to reduce the damage taken by a d12 plus their constitution modifier. The Fathomless Warlock can use their reaction, if their tentacle is within 10 feet, to reduce the damage taken by a d8 and eventually 2d8. Blade Singers can use their reaction with Song of Defense to reduce the damage by an amount equal to 5 times the spell slot level expended. A Lower Bard can use their reaction to do Cutting Words, and that would reduce the damage taken by an amount equal to the Bardic Inspiration die. Now, the options that I just mentioned all require reactions, and they all require some kind of resource expenditure. And they can't be combined since they're all reactions. But of these that I just listed, the Goliath probably would reduce the most hit points until very high levels when a couple other options catch up. Then, I should mention there is always the possibility another player character could help us out. Now, I don't tend to consider that in build decisions, but the interception combat style, the Ancestral Guardian Barbarian Spirit Shield, as well as some we've already mentioned like Cutting Words and the Fathomless Tentacle, could reduce the damage taken by another character, but they all use up reactions. Another character could also cast Warding Bond on us, giving us resistance to all damage, if we were unable to get resistance for ourselves. Just remember that Warding Bond and something like a Barbarian's Rage are not going to stack. Finally, let's discuss critical hits, because critical hit will eat up your Armor of Agathys really fast. There are some reactions we could use to negate a critical hit. The most obvious to me is Sentinel at Death's Door. This is a Grave Cleric feature that uses your reaction to negate a critical hit, though casting Silvery Barbs with your reaction is normally going to negate a critical hit as well, at least 95% of the time. Though, ideally, if Adamantine Armor is gained or available, that would outright cancel all critical hits with no reaction needed. Though, when I'm planning builds personally, I'm never counting on specific magic items unless the DM has been really clear that the parameters of this campaign are going to allow me to customize my magic item selection, whether it's through crafting or magic item purchases or through wish lists. Phew, okay, so I think we've exhausted our options to reduce the damage we take on attacks. If I missed something, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, but I think this was fairly comprehensive. I would like to thank some patrons who brainstormed with me on this topic. Math Guy Dave, Airhead, Pedro de Vaca, Gishlife, Heisenberger, Ramen Goblin, and Adurnus. I think it's time to wrap this up. Armor of Agathys. It's a good spell on its own, but with some optimizing, I think we can really up the damage that this spell ends up inflicting with a single casting. As I mentioned earlier in this video though, discussing how to be a target for melee attacks is really its own video topic. So that will be the next video before I try to squeeze all this information into a specialized build. Hope you'll join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.